at this Passover meal? By relating it to his own passion the following day. And that's what we remember always, his death and resurrection. And of course he anticipates the heavenly banquet. So there's a little bit about Matthew's understanding of the Last Supper. Now the next big scene is Gethsemane. And what do we really understand about Jesus from this scene? Well, for a moment, you know, an extraordinary thing happens. We enter Jesus' soul and we hear him pray. When people pray, it's their inmost feelings and thoughts. And we see him struggle as he tries to understand how on earth his forthcoming death would fit into the coming of the kingdom, and how on earth he could face it as a human being. This beautiful Jesus is one with us in his agony, in his facing in fear of death. And after his struggle, he comes to the point where he can say, "Not my will, but thine be done." And didn't he teach us to pray, "Thy will be done"? And so he practices what he preaches in a most beautiful and extraordinary way. And so we can, because he's given us the example, take up our cross in our day. Just a lovely little thing I found. There's an allusion to Genesis chapter 22. And that is that beautiful story of Abraham taking his most beloved son with him up the mountain, because he's heard God say, "You've got to sacrifice your only son," which of course is such a poignant sort of a moment in Scripture, the way it's beautifully written for us. And in it he says, "Sit here, Isaac, while I go over there and pray and worship." It's exactly, and a most unusual word, here, sit here, an unusual word. It's the same word that's in Matthew and in the book of Genesis. So we're in that extraordinary scene for a moment. But the other thing is too, just to say, is that we have an independent witness to Gethsemane, and that is the letter to the Hebrews. And can I just read you a little bit of that now? And it's this. "For it isn't as though we have a high priest who is incapable of feeling our weaknesses. We have one who has been tempted in every way that we are. Let us then be confident in approaching the throne of grace." That's from Hebrews chapter 4. And in chapter 5, during his life on earth, he offered up prayer and entreaty, aloud and in silent tears, to the one who had the power to save him from death. And he submitted so humbly that his prayer was heard. We learn a lot from that experience of Gethsemane, and from the synoptics of Gethsemane, and from Hebrews. Now I come to another very big matter, and that is, what is central to the Jewish authorities' condemnation of Jesus? And then I'll add a little bit to the Roman condemnation of Jesus. Firstly, it looks as though it's a big Sanhedrin trial when Jesus is brought first to the high priest's home. Well, no, that wouldn't be so. It's really a little bit of an interrogation, perhaps with the high priest only and some of his attendants, perhaps a few others are there. Now the high priest we know is Caiaphas, who ruled from 18 to 37, a long time, 19 years. But there's a power behind the throne, Annas, because his children, 5 of his kids, one a son-in-law and a grandson, have all been high priests as well. So there's an extraordinary sense of Caiaphas and Annas here. Now, all 4 Gospels have a Sanhedrin scene with the charge of causing destruction of the sanctuary or temple as the prominent charge. And they all have Jesus then being questioned about being a Messiah, the Son of God. And then they charge him with a secondary charge of blasphemy, which we know is the more important. What did happen? Well, we believe that Raymond Brown would say this, that Jesus had a fairly long ministry in Galilee, but also a long ministry in Jerusalem. And he was often preaching in the temple. And his actions there, we remember when he overturned the money changers and so on, were a prophetic action. He's speaking out about its destruction. All that would have focused hostility towards him. So there was a Sanhedrin meeting to deal with Jesus, probably in the weeks before the Passover. And at that, there were some witnesses who came forward who spoke about the destruction of the temple. And there's no evidence that at that Sanhedrin meeting the charge of Messiah or Son of God or blasphemy was raised. But after he was arrested, there comes a second sort of time with the Sanhedrin or other. This time it's just the high priest. Although we really don't know what the subject of that interrogation was. But in the mind of the evangelists, they have the problem here is Messiah, Son of God, and blasphemy. That seems to be the substance. And in fact, as Matthew puts it, it goes like this. I put you on oath, says the high priest, by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God. Now, our biggest problems are, would they have used those words, Messiah, Christ, the Son of God? Would they have used those words? It would seem that they probably were not used of Jesus until after his death. And if I could just say this very, very quickly, Jesus may have been called occasionally from his opponents and even from one or two of his disciples Messiah, but Jesus never accepted it. Really, he was ambiguous because it meant so many different things. So it didn't really define who he was. But after he died, the word became so common in Christian circles, very quickly it became almost like a surname. Jesus the Messiah, Jesus Christ. We almost think of it as a surname. So after he died, it became very clear that he really was the Messiah. But the high priest may not have been used. More than likely it wasn't used at the high priest interrogation. Nor was Son of God. But very quickly it became used by the early Christians after his death and resurrection. So Brown would make this comment. If Jesus was charged with blasphemy, it's unlikely that the main cause was the Messiah or Son of God appellation. What about Son of Man? Well, yes, it would seem Jesus did use that title. And connected with his use of that title was that in some way judgment was coming, and in some way he'd be part of that judgment. So, but Brown says this, can I just read you this again? While it's possible Jesus' use of the Son of Man could have been considered blasphemous, it's imprudent to base the historicity of the blasphemy charge against Jesus on his use of that title.